Three, two, one. Got a blast. YouTube better check it out, man. That's how I'm starting saying we best, so I gotta think of something else. We check it out, man. Hey, man, we got how iCarly destroyed Jimmy Neutron. Jimmy Neutron was my show back in the day. I even when they had it on Hulu and I had Hulu, I was watching it on Hulu. Then iCarly came out of nowhere, and Jimmy Neutron, and Timmy Turner disappeared. I don't know what happened, but we got Buddy right here to tell us what happened. Let's get into it.
Jimmy Neutron is one of the most remembered animated series of the 2000s to this day. It was part of an iconic Nickelodeon lineup that I don't think has ever been beaten. And for a long time, I took an internet rumor as fact.
I used to compare myself to Jimmy Neutron because I was a smart kid.
That the forgotten movie The Ant Bully was responsible for Jimmy Neutron getting canceled. But then I stopped to think, how true is that, really? Hi, I'm Dr. Panda, the only panda who's ever visited Candy Bar, and this is the rise and fall of Jimmy Neutron. Why did Nickelodeon demand that the show's original title, Johnny Quasar, be changed?
That is horrible.
What was the clever reason the creators insisted on making a theatrical movie first, and only then turning it into a TV series? And how true is it that The Ant Bully was the reason Jimmy Neutron got canceled? Let's get started. Although Jimmy Neutron premiered in 2002, the truth is that it was created much earlier, back in 1980. It was developed by Keith Alcorn and John Davis as a pilot called Runaway Rocket Boy, starring an early version of Jimmy named Johnny Quasar, a kid whose prominent forehead looked more like a wall. The pilot was shelved for years until Davis rediscovered the idea while moving into a new house in the early 1990s. It was reworked and submitted to Nickelodeon, and from there began the story of one of the network's most memorable animated series. However, before its premiere, some changes had to be made. Nickelodeon asked for the character's name to be changed because they felt it was too similar to Johnny Quest and Captain Quasar. After tossing around several options, Davis and Alcorn settled on Jimmy Neutron. The decision to use computer animation instead of traditional animation wasn't random or a whim either. It was carefully considered, and it was made with the intention of allowing the series to have a longer lifespan. You see, computer animation has a big advantage over traditional animation, since it allows the same models and assets to be reused throughout episodes much more easily, which helps reduce both production time and budgets. But that wouldn't be the only unorthodox decision they made for the series. In fact, I think the next one was even stranger. Davis suggested to Nickelodeon that instead of launching the show with a pilot episode, they should produce a feature film first. And once again, this idea had a very specific reason behind it. Naturally, a movie is always going to receive a much larger budget than a standard 22-minute episode. If the series had debuted with a traditional TV episode, that would have meant the character models, which would then be reused for the rest of the series, would have to be created with a much smaller budget. By launching the franchise with a movie, they could invest more money into the initial character modeling, resulting in higher quality models that could then be reused at that same level of quality for the TV episodes. Nickelodeon's response was hesitant. Quick, turn on the notification bell. The network believed it was harder to attract a movie-going audience if the TV show didn't already exist to build a fan base beforehand.
Bro, it's crazy.
In other words, it would be more difficult to convince.
It's crazy that when I was watching Jimmy Neutron, I never seen the movie till like 2027. I said 2027, 2007 or 2008. I remember watching the show before I seen the movie.
People to see a movie about a character they didn't already know. But this problem was solved in a pretty clever way. Nickelodeon began airing a series of short TV interstitials during their programming to build hype for the upcoming series. The result was a major success, since these shorts made Jimmy feel like a familiar character and got audiences excited for the movie. The film was produced by Nickelodeon Animation Studio and DNA Productions, the company founded by Davis and Alcorn, and this will be very important when we talk about the show's cancellation in just a moment. Evidently, after investing $30 million into the movie and with solid plans to turn it into a successful animated series, Nickelodeon couldn't afford to let it fail. That's why, in addition to the TV interstitials, they launched an aggressive marketing campaign that included a dedicated website, a tie-in video game published by THQ, a monthly comic strip in Nickelodeon magazine, appearances at the 2001 Kids' Choice Awards, official toys, and even cameos in commercials for Trident Gum. As a result of all this, the movie became both a box office and critical success, grossing over $102 million worldwide against a $30 million budget. It was even nominated for the very first Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2002, although it ultimately lost to Shrek. No shame.
Shout out Shrek.
The character designs were also pretty clever.
Movies.
You've probably noticed that they look almost like solid sculptures, and there's a reason for that.
They do.
2 reasons, actually.
Wow.
By the way, the video revisiting the surprisingly good Billy and Mandy Smash Bros. Clone is already up on my second channel, and I'll leave the link in the description, so go check it out. The first reason was to avoid making the characters overly realistic, and the second was to avoid having to animate clothing and hair. Nintendo gave Mario a hat, and DNA made Jimmy Neutron look like he was made out of plastic. 2 different schools of thought. The series officially launched about 6 months after the movie in June 2002, following the day-to-day adventures of Jimmy Neutron and his friends in Retroville. It was a ratings success, running for 3 seasons and more than 50 episodes. The show followed a generally predictable but still charming structure. Jimmy would invent something to solve a small problem. It would backfire spectacularly, forcing him to deal with a much bigger mess, and ultimately learn a lesson by the end. When I was younger, I thought Jimmy was Nickelodeon's answer to Cartoon Network's Dexter. But while both focus on genius kids, I think each has its own identity. And beyond the premise, they're not really that similar. The series was so successful that it even became part of one of the most memorable crossovers of our childhoods, the Jimmy Power Hour. But it wasn't just that. Jimmy Neutron also had 4 video games, plus characters from the franchise appearing in around 15 different Nickelodeon crossover games, and even an iconic ride at Universal Studios, an attraction that in fact holds the record for the second shortest ride turnaround in Universal Orlando's history, with a construction time of just 5 months and 2 weeks. And if you were a Nickelodeon fan and never got to ride it, I truly feel for you, because it was an incredible experience where you had to chase Ooblar through different environments from other Nicktoons. The series also had a spin-off, but we don't talk about that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, both the movie and the series were produced by Nickelodeon Animation Studio and DNA Productions. And this is where we get to the most important part of this video. Even if you think you don't recognize DNA's name, I'm sure you remember this logo that appeared at the end of every episode of the series. The studio was founded in 1987 using a $5,000 loan, and originally focused on small projects for other companies like Dairy Queen, producing commercials and corporate videos. But alongside that work, Davis and Alcorn also enjoyed making short animated films with pretty crude humor in their free time, which they would submit to animation festivals. It was at one of these festivals that they met Steve Odekirk, who saw their reel for the project when it was still called Johnny Quasar, and decided to partner with them on future projects. That partnership wasn't initially for Jimmy Neutron, but for other productions like Santa vs. the Snowman in 1997. Either way, this collaboration allowed the studio to grow from 17 employees to around 30, and to take part in new projects like Olive the Other Reindeer, because apparently they're big fans of Christmas. You and me both, DNA Productions, you and me both. At this point, DNA was still a relatively small Texas-based company, but it was clearly starting to play in the big leagues. I mean, Olive the Other Reindeer was produced by the Curiosity Company, owned by Matt Groening, and the main character was voiced by Drew Barrymore. In short, DNA was growing. And that brings us to the moment when DNA signed with Nickelodeon to release the Jimmy Neutron movie, followed by the animated series which the studio would work on full-time. While still working on Jimmy Neutron, DNA also co-produced an animated film released in 2006 called The Ant Bully. I won't go too deep into the plot, but it's basically about a kid who enjoys terrorizing an ant colony until one day he's shrunk down and forced to live and work among them. This was only the studio's second feature film, and although they didn't know it at the time, it would also be their last. The problem was that despite featuring major stars like Julia Roberts or Nicolas Cage, the movie ended up being a complete failure. And unlike other projects DNA had worked on, this wasn't a small, low-budget passion project. DNA, alongside other production companies like Warner Brothers and Legendary Pictures, invested around $50 million into the film. But it only managed to gross about $55 million worldwide, resulting in massive losses for everyone involved. The big rumor online is that this financial disaster forced the studio to shut down, which in turn led to the forced cancellation of Jimmy Neutron. There are even claims that scripts for a planned 4th season were ready to go, but were never produced. But how true is all of this really? Well, get ready for an emotional roller coaster. My research first led me to this interview given by John Davis, where he directly addresses the topic of Jimmy Neutron and the Ant Bully. In it, Davis explains that thanks to the success of Jimmy Neutron, the studio grew significantly and had essentially its entire staff working on the series. He claims the timing was perfect because the start of production on The Ant Bully coincided with the moment when Jimmy Neutron had already reached its 3rd season, which the team knew in advance would be the last one.
Damn.
In other words, Davis says that Nickelodeon had already decided to end Jimmy Neutron before The Ant Bully was even released.
Damn,
and there it is. Mystery solved, right? The Ant Bully didn't kill Jimmy Neutron. Or did it?
No,
At first, I thought that was the end of it. But the more I kept digging, the less everything seemed to line up. So I kept investigating. And then I found this. This is a Nielsen ratings report that lists the top 15 programs on cable networks during the week of March 13th, 2006, the very year Jimmy Neutron ended. On that list, Jimmy Neutron ranks at number 13. And that's huge. The ratings were clearly in the show's favor. But it doesn't stop there, because I also found another Nielsen ratings list from December 2006, roughly a month after the series had already concluded. This list shows the same trend, with Jimmy Neutron pulling ratings.
Shout out Hannah Montana, shout out That's So Raven, shout out Ned, the Classified School Survivor Guide. The old people, not the ones now. Go watch that video.
Comparable to or even higher than other incredibly successful Nickelodeon shows like SpongeBob and the Fairly Odd Parents. In fact, 2 of the 3 specials of the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour were released in 2006, which further affirms that Jimmy Neutron was doing extremely well right up until the end. So what am I getting at? It makes no sense for Nickelodeon to independently cancel the show after just 3 seasons when by every measurable metric, it was not only one of the network's biggest hits, but one of the most successful shows on television in the entire United States. Now, this is where I want to emphasize what we do know for a fact, and that is that Ant Bully did in fact kill DNA Productions. Davis himself confirms this in the interview, where he explains that the company had grown so large due to the workload required for that film that they were soon forced to shut down after failing to secure new projects that could keep the studio alive. And while one could argue that with more than 55 episodes produced, Nickelodeon already had enough content to air at least 1 episode of Jimmy Neutron per week for an entire year, that didn't stop them with SpongeBob or Fairly Odd Parents, which were the other 2 top series on the network at the time. Even if DNA owned a percentage of Jimmy Neutron, Nickelodeon could have arranged to buy the rights from them considering how successful the series was. By the time Jimmy Neutron ended, SpongeBob and Fairly Odd Parents already had more than 70 episodes produced and continued in production without
how long SpongeBob been running, bro. SpongeBob been running before I was born, and I believe it's still running.
Any issues. So if that didn't stop Nick with those 2 shows, it makes no sense that it would have stopped them with Jimmy Neutron. But then, I came across something that changed everything. A post from 2006, the same year Jimmy was canceled, written by Butch Hartman, the creator of Fairly Odd Parents. The post was originally published on his blog, but it has since been deleted, and only a rewritten version remains on the wiki. In it, Butch made a very important announcement. Both of his shows, Fairly Odd Parents and Danny Phantom, would be officially coming to an end. Danny would end after reaching 53 episodes, while the 3rd part of the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour would serve as the series finale for Fairly Odd Parents. Isn't that strange? Nickelodeon canceling 3 of its animated series in the same year, 2 of which were among the most successful on the channel. Eventually, Fairly Odd Parents would return in 2008, but Jimmy Neutron would not. And this is where my research hit a dead end, until I found one key piece that I think perfectly explains why these abrupt endings happened. Right in 2006, there was a major shift in Nickelodeon's leadership when Seema Zargami became president of the network's Kids and Family Group, which included, among others, Nick at Night, Nick Jr., and yes, the Nicktoons. That's a lot of coincidence, isn't it? But this wasn't her first role at Nickelodeon. In fact, she had been with the company for nearly 20 years. And even before her promotion in 2006, she already held a major position starting in 2004 as president of Nickelodeon Television. And that's when she really began her revolution within the network. Up until 2004, Nickelodeon's focus had been almost exclusively on kids in general, boys and girls alike, which was clearly reflected in the channel's programming. But with Zargami's arrival, there was a strategic shift toward targeting girls between the ages of 9 and 14. The reason was simple. Nickelodeon believed that this market was far more lucrative for advertisers. It was a demographic that consumed teen magazines, fashion, and pop music, and one that was also beginning to have its own purchasing power. On top of that, it allowed Nickelodeon to follow a strategy Disney had already been using for years, becoming a pop star factory and fully exploiting the advantages of also being a record label, including album sales, concerts and tours, and music royalties. That's why we started seeing a rise in teen-focused shows with a female lead on Nickelodeon, like Zoe 101 in 2005, iCarly in 2007, and Victorious in 2010.
Like I said, this is when it all started hitting, bro. They ended all of those shows at once. It started with the realism, brought in Zoe 101, Victorious, iCarly. What else came out at that point? I don't know what else came out at that point. Didn't End Classified come out of that? No, it was already going. I don't know.
This didn't work out for them as well as it did for Disney. Either way, this shift in focus also required sacrifices, and we saw those sacrifices in 2006. So while Ant Bully did kill the studio that produced Jimmy Neutron, I believe the real culprit behind the show's death was Nickelodeon's demographic shift. Now, do you remember The Wild Thornberrys, that show about a family of wildlife documentary filmmakers with a daughter who could talk to animals, a son who thought he was Tarzan?
The show. But that's in a whole nother video. Appreciate y'all for tuning in, bro. I'm gonna get at y'all on the next one, man.